Welcome aboard the Pink Monorail podcast. This show normally features Shelley, aka the Fabulous Disney Babe, and Alice Hill. My name is Noah. I'm the host of the Street Writer podcast, where I talk mainly about fighting games. I'm also a huge Disney fan. I'm filling in for Fab and Alice with a report on how the Disney parks got started in Asia. So let's start with the challenges of Western companies setting up resorts in the East. Appealing to the steadily growing Chinese tourist base had turned out to be difficult for foreign travel agencies. Companies in the US and Europe had begun training their employees in cultural differences between Chinese tourists and other international visitors. The term China Ready had become a new catchphrase in guest services. In 2013, the Preferred Hotel Group announced a partnership with 650 member hotels. They were putting the China Ready stamp of approval on resorts the world over and would be helping the traveler plan accommodations overseas. The ways in which Chinese visitors preferred to be addressed, whom should be addressed in groups, what hand gestures were acceptable, and even the dishes that should be included on hotel menus had become a point of discussion for the largest hotel chains. Even the items that should be available in their hotel rooms were unique when compared to visitors from other nations. Instead of ice water, guests should have a carafe of hot water waiting for them in case they brought their own tea or even instant noodles for a snack. Many hotels had learned to offer hot soup or hot tea with meals, as was customary in most Asian restaurants. The right food offerings could make visitors feel very welcome and color their overall impression of a visit. In China and Korea, friends and family did not always greet each other with a typical hello, but instead, "Have you eaten yet?" It was more intimate and inviting and was a simple phrase that could be used to make even the largest Western chain feel like home to weary travelers. The expectations that these tourists had for Western hotels was very high. In many instances, the Chinese expected to be treated like the number one priority based on how much money they had spent just to travel abroad. If, for example, a clerk in a Western hotel could not get a Chinese native a room key shortly after checking in, then they might be offended. The customer might assume that the slowness was due to racial bias against the Chinese instead of simple inefficiency. Disney hoped to stem that perception by offering exceptional customer service domestically at two unique hotels in China. The Hollywood Hotel and the Hong Kong Disneyland Hotel were richly themed and had the same attention to detail as the best hotels they had previously built. The Hong Kong Disneyland Hotel was modeled after the Queen Anne architectural style and incorporated the appropriate landscaping, fixtures, and details that one would expect to find in a classic building. Of course, it also had all the modern amenities and a familiar Disney twist. It was decorated with character art, sculptures, and paintings created in a classic style to reinforce the theme within each room and even on the property itself. For example, the maze garden in the courtyard was immaculately tended to, as it would have if it had been in a private country estate. Yet, it also had the shape of Mickey Mouse in the center. The interior details also reflected Chinese art and design. The Crystal Lotus restaurant actually featured thousands of crystal lotus flowers in the lighting and chandeliers. The lotus was a favorite subject in traditional Chinese landscape painting. Its design was worked into the pattern of the carpets in the Disneyland Hotel. The second hotel, the Hollywood Hotel, was modeled on the Art Deco movement. The bright lights, bold colors, and strong shapes rekindled the golden age of Hollywood. Corresponding art of the mascot characters was done with them in the classic black and white motif. They were dressed in top hats and tails, as if they were arriving to a movie premiere. These images were framed on the walls, in faux posters, and even intricate etchings on the doors and paneling. No detail was overlooked, as even the stationery and toiletries were printed in the art style of each respective hotel. The Imagineers responsible for designing the property had used the same techniques that they applied for attractions into the presentation of each hotel. They stuck to an idea, created a theme, and presented a story. At every opportunity, hotel guests were reminded that this place was special and that they were welcome as friends. The Disney Company had a well-established track record in guest services. Their parks, hotels, and cruise lines had consistently been ranked at the top in customer surveys. In Japan, they had learned the importance of quality design and execution of their resorts. Tokyo Disneyland and Tokyo DisneySea were surrounded by more than a dozen hotels, 3 of which were co-owned or operated by the Disney Company: the Tokyo Disneyland Hotel, Tokyo DisneySea Hotel Miracosta, and Disney's Ambassador Hotel. A 4th hotel off-property was going to be taken over and remodeled from the Palm and Fountain Terrace Hotel. It would become the budget-friendly Tokyo Disney Celebration Hotel. The other 6 hotels on property were called the Tokyo Disney Resort Official Hotels. These included the Sunroute Plaza Hotel, Tokyo Bay Maihama Hotel, Tokyo Bay Maihama Hotel Club Resort, Hilton Tokyo Bay, Hotel Okura Tokyo Bay, and Sheraton Grande Tokyo Bay Hotel. The 4 hotels just off company property: the Urayusu Brighton Hotel, Oriental Hotel Tokyo Bay, Hotel Emion Tokyo Bay, Palm and Fountain Terrace Hotel, and Mitsui Garden Prana Tokyo Bay were called the Tokyo Disney Partner Hotels. All of the hotels featured monorail service or shuttle buses with large Mickey Mouse windows on them. Patrons would be dropped off at the Esplanade and choose whether they were visiting Tokyo Disneyland or Tokyo DisneySea. The theme parks were a strong draw. The hotels could run at high capacity year-round. Part of the reason for this was because of the population density of Japan. There was never a shortage of patrons. Think about the population of the USA, but crammed into a nation the size of California. There was no space to build a Walt Disney World. The property in Japan was among the most expensive in the world. Having one company create a park with multiple themed lands and a dozen hotels spread out over thousands of acres was out of the question. Instead, the Japanese had one Magic Kingdom-sized park. They took great care of it. They were constantly plussing the attractions, adding new parades, events, and merchandise every season. They would try to avoid recycling any decorations, themes, or even costumes for the mascot characters each season. These were very expensive business decisions. However, the proof was seen at the gate. Season ticket holders and one-day visitors increased from year to year and showed no sign of slowing. The Oriental Land Company, the private company that ran the park, licensed the Disney name, and even rented Imagineers from the Disney Company, had just enough land to build a second gate. With Tokyo DisneySea in place, the Hotel Miracosta, and bustling tourism trade, the Japanese truly had a unique resort that was a guarantee to be a major draw for citizens. People could take a high-speed train from just about anywhere in the country to Tokyo. They could spend a day in Disneyland with their families and be back home that night. The hotels on and off property continued putting in tremendous effort to attract visitors as well. Each hotel at the Tokyo Disneyland Resort had its own unique theme. No two were even remotely alike. They had their own architecture, their own parking, spa, restaurants, pools, shops, and other amenities. Each staff member was costumed as nicely as the in-park employees. Every few months, the hotels would change out the decorations for the rooms based on the season or during a particular park celebration. These details included all new gift baskets and toys for the families, linens, pillows, and even door hangers. Absolutely everything was cycled out on a regular basis. Each visit to the hotels was completely different for returning guests. The hotels avoided recycling old items from season to season, especially in the premium rooms. The consumers had come to expect that Disney would maintain this level of upkeep in the parks as well. They were not disappointed. The same could not necessarily be said of the parks in the USA, where repairs and pluses seemed few and far between. It was not known if Hong Kong Disneyland or Shanghai Disneyland expected their hotels to adhere to the Japanese level of detail. It would only make sense if they did, considering that China also had a densely packed client base that was eager to experience a high-quality resort. The genius behind most of the vacation property Disney had ever built, including the highly successful cruise line, was master planner and architect Wing T. Chow. The former executive vice president of Disney Imagineering and vice chairman Asia Pacific Development, Walt Disney Parks and Resorts, was one of the most respected and award-winning people in the industry. Sadly, most park and animation fans have never heard of him. For over 30 years, he helped find the right architects and partners on the Disney hotels and vacation clubs. He was conscientious of the expectations that every nation had when they received a hotel that he had planned. For example, at Hong Kong Disneyland, he used the principles of feng shui to orient the buildings and doorways in the right angles and positions. Chinese culture believed that they could help capture luck and dispel negative energy with the correct placement of doors, corridors, and mirrors. Mr. Chow received an award in 2007 from the Chinese hotel industry for the Disney Hollywood Hotel. It was nominated in the Best Theme category. He knew that the details in planning for each property had to be distinct. He would oversee everything that went into each hotel, such as house colors and employee costumes, to the broader logistical challenges of golf courses and sports centers. About $8 billion worth of property had been funneled through the eyes of one very capable person. Up until his retirement from the company in 2009, he demonstrated that their Asian customers appreciated attention to detail. The hotels and cruise ships that he planned would constantly be plussing the experience, as Walt would often say. Guests that felt like the company was going out of their way to make their experience memorable would appreciate the effort and make an emotional connection to the parks and people. The positive experience would translate to repeat visits and plenty of dining and shopping throughout a lifetime. Very few companies could claim to have had this level of success for more than half a century. Although Hong Kong was the newest resort, by no stretch of the imagination were the hotels limited. When Disneyland first opened, Walt did not have enough money or resources to buy all of the land around the park that he wanted. As such, a number of less than stellar hotels popped up around the property. Many were motels with a kitschy theme. As the park became successful, the Disney company purchased back the land from other hotels and began developing their own property. Within a few decades, the park was bordered by multiple hotels. This created the template that Disney would use again in every new park. Each hotel offered its own theme, amenities, and features, from the budget-minded Paradise Pier to the newly renovated Disneyland Hotel and even the upscale Grand Californian. There was a hotel for every taste and type of consumer. This formula would be revised and perfected in the Japanese parks. The property had humble beginnings but became a true resort because it offered 3 unique hotels, a movie complex, shopping center, and 2 world-famous parks on property. A family could have plenty to do over a multi-day vacation without ever leaving the resort. Hong Kong Disneyland also came from humble beginnings. The park opened even smaller than the original Disneyland. However, it had 2 very well-made hotels and an expansion that helped it gain traction. If attendance continued to climb, then perhaps they would get a 3rd hotel in the process. Disney had made some costly mistakes when they debuted in China, but had contingency plans in place. The extra land they purchased around Hong Kong came in handy a few years after opening. Well, technically, they didn't buy this extra land. The government actually helped dredge up and create an artificial island around Hong Kong just in case. They had room to double the size of the park and add more hotels and a shopping complex if they had to. Senior Disney members were hoping to learn from the mistakes made in Hong Kong going into the Shanghai project. So what were the differences between Hong Kong and Shanghai? Why was this site selected as the next major park? Pack your bags, because the next stop for the pink monorail will be Shanghai. Despite residing in the same nation, both Shanghai and Hong Kong were different experiences culturally. They had different clientele, different expectations, and even different languages. Think of the diversity experienced in the USA. The people from New York had different tastes from those in Atlanta, Houston, or San Francisco. People from the East, South, and West had different idioms, pronunciations, and accents, yet all of those towns could claim to be uniquely American. Those were mild distinctions between regions in the USA. More than 700 miles separated Hong Kong from Shanghai, but the cultural differences seemed continents apart. Cantonese was the major language spoken in Hong Kong, and Mandarin was a distant second. The primary language in Shanghai was Wu Chinese. China consisted of more than 50 unique ethnic groups that had 8 major languages spoken and a dozen written languages that did not use traditional or simplified Chinese characters. The complexities between signage and language between the regions could have been a problem if Disney had not settled on a major city. Both Disney sites had unique stories, with Shanghai claiming a direct connection to the oldest dynasties and earliest historical movements of the nation. It was closer to being a classical Chinese city compared to the colonized islands of Hong Kong. While both cities were known for their impressive skylines and port architecture, there was a distinct difference in population. 7 million people made Hong Kong their home, but more than 23 million resided in Shanghai. The largest concentration of China's wealthy and booming middle class also lived in Shanghai. It was the largest city in China, and by population, it was the largest city in the world. As an overseas tourist destination, Shanghai was second only to Beijing. Second place was not bad, considering Shanghai did not have anywhere near the air quality issues that had been plaguing Beijing. The ports of Shanghai controlled about 25% of the imports and exports and generate over 12% of China's total revenue, despite only taking up less than 0.06% of the nation's land area. Shanghai was not the leader in GDP growth. In fact, it was near the bottom, along with Beijing. At the top were cities like Gansu and Yunnan. Of course, it would be better to build a theme park where the population and money was, rather than where the industrial booms were happening. Developing a resort in such a populated area was a challenge for the Disney company. Shanghai was like Hong Kong, in that both cities had rivers and estuaries that broke up large plots of land. Finding a centralized location to develop a resort would be a challenge. In Tokyo and Hong Kong, that was solved by building near the coast, if not out from the coast altogether. Disney had learned how to prepare the land and deal with challenging terrain and large bodies of water during the development of Walt Disney World some 40 years prior. The company still needed a partner in Shanghai that could help with all the laws, regulations, and logistics of developing and running a massive resort. The partnership that Disney had with Hong Kong International Theme Parks Limited carried no bearing in Shanghai. The company had to form a new partnership with the local government. The Shanghai Shendi Group, SSG, was founded. 3 separate companies owned by the Shanghai government and Disney held shares in the company. 4 square kilometers of development land were cleared for park property, with an additional 7 square kilometers available as expansion for the park and hotel properties. The park had a footprint that was much larger than Hong Kong, with lots of room for growth. Something unique to the property were 11 acres of what was called a green area, or untouched forest land, set in front of the castle, and several other acres interspersed between the various themed lands. The first phase of construction, the actual park development budget, was $3.75 billion. The investment amounts were split, with Disney holding 43% of the shares and the Shanghai Shendi Group holding the remaining 57%. Financing was proportional to ownership. A joint venture management company was also created, with Disney owning a 70% stake and the SSG Group owning a 30% stake. The management company would be responsible for creating, developing, and operating the resort. Having a solid business structure in place was critical for running a resort of this magnitude. The Chinese government was said to be run like a highly regulated bureaucracy, and the large companies within China tended to fit the model. Both the SSG and the management company had to follow the same bureaucratic order. Disney had learned to work closer with their partners after the initial problems with Hong Kong. Disney shaped their business plan for China after studying their partnership in Tokyo, Japan. Disney entered theme park operations in Japan as a licensor and not a partner to the Oriental Land Company, OLC. The major investor for the OLC was the Keisei Electric Railway Company, the private railway company that owned and managed Tokyo Disneyland, Tokyo Disney Sea, Tokyo Disneyland Hotel, Tokyo Disney Sea Hotel Miracosta, and Disney's Ambassador Hotel. Mitsui Fudosan was a real estate developer that also owned a large portion of the OLC. The OLC also owned taxi, bus, and railway services which could funnel guests into the parks. As a private company, the OLC was able to run promotions, shows, and expansions on a much faster schedule than the Disney company. They did not have to wait for approval from every level in the chain of command or any stockholders if they wanted to change something in the park. The parks got seasonal changes, set dressing, and parades. The surrounding hotels got seasonal makeovers as well. Guests could even expect to see major changes on a monthly basis. It was a much faster promotional schedule than was available in any other Disney park, and it kept visitors flocking to the resort year after year. Although they did not take a portion of the gate, the Disney company still made tremendous money on the venture. Walt Disney Attractions Japan paid the Disney company license fees for characters and likenesses. Based on the volume of products that the park produced each year, including toys, clothing, the wrapping on food products, signs, and menus, this was a considerable amount. However, Disney also leased their Imagineers to the OLC to design and build the Tokyo Disneyland Park, which opened on April 1983, as well as Tokyo Disney Sea, which opened on September 2001. Upgrades to the park and new installations would require the Imagineers to be available year-round, and Disney would get paid generously for their services. I am not certain if Disney hoped that their management company in Shanghai would be able to work as quickly and efficiently as the OLC operated in Japan. The additional layers of Chinese bureaucracy could make operations slower. The executives at the Disney company did notice that the Japanese parks could teach the parent company a lot about gate, attendance, trends, and services. In the USA, the Disney company had worked on many different ways to measure customer satisfaction, identify trends, and other metrics. The retail and food service numbers could be used to create metrics for those divisions of the company. However, there were other issues that were more nebulous. What did patrons think about their visit? What did not meet their satisfaction? Which rides, if any, did they go on? Disney in the USA had employees working near the gate to take short surveys of guests on a daily basis. These cross-samples was good general information, but lacking on details. When the theme park operated using a ticket book, it was easy to measure which attractions were performing well and which were not. Budgets could be set based on the popularity of each attraction. Maintenance budgets were proportional to the use a ride received, and money could even be budgeted on plussing an attraction that was underperforming. When the park phased out the ticket system in 1982 and opened general admission to all the rides, it became much harder to measure the ride statistics. The Disney company had spent the next 30 years looking for another way to measure performance and appease long wait times. They started with FastPass and FastPass Plus systems in Disneyland and Walt Disney World, allowing riders to pick up a ticket early and return later in the day for a shorter queue. While these were a measure of a ride's popularity, they did not gather precise numbers. Some visitors would pick up several different fast passes throughout the day, but never used them, giving inaccurate measures at the ticket dispenser. In 2013, Walt Disney World began testing the Magic Band system. It was a programmable plastic wristband that could be used to buy merchandise, pay for food, and even open hotel doors. It could also be used as a counter and trigger effects on some attractions. A variation of the annual pass with fraud prevention technology was also developed, known as My Magic Plus. A combined electronic gate system which required a plastic card with an embedded RFID profile of the visitor along with a fingerprint scanner. The system was unique but seemed too slow for rapid processing at the gate. Large-scale deployment, maintenance, and upgrades of this technology would be expensive for the company. Not only that, but the fingerprint profiles had to be stored somewhere. In the era where the NSA had raised concerns about privacy in the USA, some wondered if Disney was gathering too much personal data from visitors. Hackers the world over had been keeping tabs on the technology used for tracking purposes. These hackers could figure out the security algorithms and reverse engineer the rubber MyPass bands easily. Hackers in China were unique in that many had access to factories and channels of distribution that could put knockoff bracelets on the streets of Hong Kong and Shanghai, not to mention that some hacking groups were government sponsored. How would Disney protect their data, ride patents, and technology within China? Disney chairman and CEO Bob Iger answered some of those questions in a 2016 interview with Bloomberg TV. Cell phones would be the key to the kingdom. Iger said, "What you see in Shanghai is a park that from a technological perspective is more advanced than anything we've ever built." He added, "The consumer will be able to buy their tickets, use their mobile devices in far more advanced, compelling ways than any other place from a theme park perspective than we are today." There were many challenges of theme park operations. Chief among the non-staff questions were questions on handling the attractions themselves. Creating budgets for rides based on performance and customer wait times, as well as satisfaction, was nebulous for parks that had unlimited rides for all customers. The Disney company learned that Japan had been the most efficient at tracking attendance and ride data. When Tokyo Disneyland first opened 35 years ago, the company was advised to use turnstiles to track riders for each attraction. They followed what they were taught to the letter and used turnstiles and later light counters to track riders either entering or leaving the attractions. They knew with absolute certainty which rides were performing well and which needed attention. They did not deviate from what worked more than 30 years ago. They did not waste time, energy, or resources to figure out a better tracking system. Whether the Magic Pass technology, My Magic Plus, or even smartphone technology was the future in China, perhaps the company would stick with what worked in Japan. It was simpler, faster, and much more secure for visitors. But what exactly was in the works for Shanghai Disneyland? How did it differ from Hong Kong Disneyland? Shanghai Disneyland would be building on more than half a century of innovation from the Walt Disney Company. Some of the best and brightest minds in Imagineering, management, and the business side of Disney had been putting their collective efforts into the project. The resort was supposed to be the swan song for Robert Iger. Originally, he was supposed to step down as CEO in March 2015, but he signed on to stay with the company for the foreseeable future to make sure that the resort got off to a good start. He would also help to see that the properties from Lucasfilms, such as Star Wars and Marvel, would have a long-term plan in place as well. For the Shanghai project, Disney announced that the goal was for the resort to offer an experience that was, and this is quote, authentically Disney and distinctly Chinese, end quote. The term was a little nebulous, but a lot could actually be inferred from the announcement. The company went into Shanghai with their eyes open. They wanted to find out what made the city special. What was it that kept families there for countless generations? How did it continue to grow when so many other cities had stagnated in the global recession? Shanghai had its own destinations for tourists well before Disney ever came calling. The Nanjing Road, for example, was China's #1 commercial district. It was a collection of shops, boutiques, and restaurants visited by 1.7 million people each day. It was far busier than any street in Hong Kong, yet not overwhelming for visitors. Despite the massive boom in high-rise construction, there were still locations within the city that had gone unchanged for centuries. These places were more than quaint. They harkened back to the earlier dynastic eras. Some echo the places where the Communist Party was founded. The buildings, side roads, and alleys around Nanjing seem to be taken out of a history textbook. Jintiandi was one such street, surrounded by historical buildings that retained the atmosphere and architecture of early 20th century China. Mainland visitors could enjoy tea in this casual setting, as their ancestors had centuries earlier. Nanjing Road and Jingtiandi were points of interest because they defied progress. These streets did more than romanticize the past. They were still fully functional and fully accessible. They provided work, security, and taxes to the local economy. They were carved into the city and protected by an invisible hand, even as enormous buildings sprung up all around. In a word, these locations had a little bit of magic, but not as much as Yuyuan Garden. The people of China were fond of nature and parks as well. One famous landmark in Shanghai was Yuyuan Garden. It was a Ming and Qing architecture park with 6 unique areas, including a restored temple, restaurants, and bazaar for visitors to explore. Street performers would appear like clockwork to entertain the crowds, especially on busy days. It was an ancient-looking palace that beguiled visitors with its modern conveniences. It combined classic architecture, rock gardens, and dynastic-looking sculptures, but with modern construction. The Hu Ting tea house, for example, looked like it was out of a fairy tale. The 2-story tea house was perched over a reflective pond, connected to the park by zigzagging bridges. If I didn't know better, I would say that the architects were Imagineers themselves. The builders of Yuyuan Garden framed the buildings using strategically placed bridges and trees. They created streets and alleys that funneled visitors from shop to shop. They controlled traffic through the park and helped break up gardens using strategically placed walls and gateways, which made every area of the park look larger than it was. The same elements that made Main Street USA memorable in Disneyland had been used by people outside of the company. Chinese travel spots were not all rooted in shopping and sightseeing. There were over 100 million practicing Buddhists in China. Each major city had a temple that also doubled as a tourist destination. In Shanghai, it was the Jade Buddha Temple. The temple was founded in the late 19th century and featured 2 enormous jade figures which had been brought over from Burma and a large marble statue that was a gift from Singapore. The statues of Buddha were well known, but the beauty of the temples, inside and out, was astonishing. The bold color choices, intricate furniture carvings, elaborate reliefs, red lanterns, and guardian dragons reminded visitors that the nation had descended from an ancient culture that was very much alive and well. The Disney Company entered Shanghai with time and perspective on their side. The time spent preparing the land for construction was cushioned by the Hong Kong Disneyland expansion. They learned a great deal from their operations in Tokyo and from their mistakes in Hong Kong. They learned how to cater to the differences and similarities between Japanese and Chinese customers. They also learned what they needed to change in order to color the impression of the park for Chinese visitors. Taking several pages from the shopping, park, and restaurant notebooks, Shanghai Disneyland would feature a number of unique restaurants, such as the Wandering Moon Tea House, which would provide customers a respite from the hustle and bustle of a theme park. It was just one of many distinct Chinese-influenced restaurants and tea houses on property. The centerpiece of every Disneyland park was the castle, and Shanghai would be getting the tallest, biggest, and therefore best castle. The company started off too small in Hong Kong, and the locals were put off by how little the company seemed to think of them. The Enchanted Storybook Castle, previously known as the Fantastic Fairy Tale Castle, had been featured for years in promotional material and in models before the concrete had even been poured. It actually had interactive elements, multiple stories, shops, and a meet and greet area. It even had features and effects programmed into walls and lights that were exclusive to Shanghai. The highlight for guests was a boat ride that went under and around the castle. This would be the first castle to feature such an attraction. Disney would get a second chance to make a first impression in the mainland. The plans for Shanghai had the land spread out somewhat more than in any other park. Disneyland in Anaheim was considered quaint, by visitors to the Magic Kingdom in Florida. It was compact, with different lands placed flush against each other. Streets were often cramped on busy days, and there was a bottleneck of pedestrians clogging up the entrances for each land. Although the Magic Kingdom looked identical in terms of layout and organization, it was more spaced out to allow room for visitors and for the transitions into each land to be much smoother. It would become the template that the Paris and Tokyo parts were based on. Early concept art and models for Shanghai showed that the lands, attractions, and shopping complexes were even more spaced out. There were more trees, trails, ponds, and lakes intertwined within the property. There were multiple reasons for this. Aesthetically, the park looked greener as each themed area was surrounded by nature. The popularity of Yuyuan Garden had undoubtedly inspired the design for portions of this park. The extra space also absorbed the ride noise, which often bled over from land to land in other parks. It could also absorb the ambient noise from the millions of expected guests. The water features were also established so that the company could put on changing light shows similar to the World of Color throughout the year. Tokyo Disney Sea had multiple lakes and channels as well. They had floats and parades that ran day and night. There was a chance that Shanghai would get adaptations of some of these shows if an entire production was not already scheduled to be transitioned from Japan directly. There was room to expand and add attractions if the park swelled in attendance, yet all of the extra land also had a functional purpose. Shanghai was on the northern end of the monsoon belt. Between spring and summer, the park could get anywhere from 40 to 60 inches of rain. Without land to absorb the runoff, then guests and attractions could quickly find themselves underwater. Hong Kong was actually in the heart of the monsoon belt. It could expect to get 60 inches or more every year. Hong Kong had extra land to absorb the runoff as well as channels that fed into rivers. The decision to build the two parks in port areas where runoff could easily get out to sea was inspired planning. Well, it would have been inspired if it had not already been something that Walt himself had to contend with in Florida. Because of the annual precipitation there, he had to plan more indoor attractions and covered attractions at Disney World. These lessons would carry over into the Asian parks. There was much more to Shanghai than just a massive castle and some extra land in the works. Unfortunately for the Disney company, there was a theme park construction boom in China, and in the time it took them to get Hong Kong and Shanghai resorts off the ground, there were many new players on the field. We're going to take a look at some of these. Disney had been making inroads into television and film production in China, yet there were still issues dealing with counterfeiters and copycats in the creative industry. It was something to be expected. The booming middle class of China was eager for entertainment, and unscrupulous companies were looking to get shows, toys, games, films, and attractions to the masses as fast as possible. The quick buck could be made in copying the trends and getting them to market right away. It was something that had plagued China's reputation through the 20th and 21st centuries. The nation had been known for blatantly copying merchandise, programming, and even cultural figures and trying to pass them off as the genuine article. Even with Disney making partners in China, there was no protection from counterfeiters. Remember when I mentioned that in the Asia Top 1000 brand campaign, when it did not rank Disney but had Apple near the top of the list? It was a dual sword of Chinese consumer culture. Apple made products that were status symbols, and everyone wanted to buy into the brand, yet many settled for counterfeit Apple products and ended up supporting people that were creating fake Apple stores on the mainland. It happened with products made by other companies, like Nike and Sony as well. For every genuine article, there were thousands and thousands of copies. Guanxi worked both ways in the business world. Not only could it help a legitimate venture off the ground, but it could also work for illegal enterprises. Guanxi ensured that counterfeit goods were distributed while officials and police were not looking too closely at their business. Some unscrupulous producers thought that they could dupe the public and release films in theaters that many assumed were created by Disney, or in the case of the film The Autobots, audiences in China thought the film was by Pixar. The producers of the Autobots claimed to know nothing of the Cars film, and it was simple coincidence. Of course, if you were to watch the footage, you would spot vehicles that were eerily similar to the cast in Cars. Not only that, but the animators included a vehicle that looked like the Batmobile from the original Tim Burton version of Batman. This pattern was repeated in many other areas of entertainment. Game companies would release web and phone titles that were rip-offs of popular games from the West. Musicians would shoot videos just like their Western counterparts, and even television hosts would poach the IP of most popular primetime figures. This culture of copying the trends extended out to theme parks as well. Stefan Zwanziger, aka the theme park guy, did a fantastic job on summarizing the problems with China's amusement park industry. Some parks, like Joyland, even had the audacity to feature their own Disney store, which was a fake and filled with walls of counterfeit items. The counterfeiters even went to the trouble of creating fake tags and hologram stickers claiming to be from the real park. Part of the reason that China was comfortable with copying the rest of the world was a social construct. Remember that the traditional social hierarchy put officials and scholars at the top and artisans at the bottom, below even peasants and farmers. Think about how creative individuals were frowned upon. Their ideas, their own characters and ventures were passed over because they did not come from the top. Of course, those in positions at the top did not necessarily come up with anything original. Instead, they looked at the hot trends from the West and ordered their underlings to copy those things and get them to market ASAP. The merchants were at the bottom of the hierarchy and were responsible to get these things, whether game, soft good, or toy, into the hands of as many people as possible. It was counter to the creative culture from the West, a culture that saw characters like Spider-Man, Kermit the Frog, and Mickey Mouse come from nowhere and become icons. Stan Lee, Jim Henson, and Walt Disney would have been lost in the shuffle of other idea men had they been born in China. So long as the social order remained the same in China, then their own ideas, their own attractions, and even mascots would seem inferior in the eyes of their own citizens. This was a sad reality, considering that the next Walt Disney may have very well come from China. The Disney company had been pouring billions into China, but that was nothing compared to how much local business ventures had been doing over the past 20 years. In Hong Kong alone, there were a half dozen parks that were almost as memorable as Disneyland. One of the biggest parks in China, and certainly bigger than Hong Kong Disneyland even after the expansion, was called Ocean Park. It was part theme park, animal park, and part aquarium. Kids could find plenty of activities, elderly visitors could enjoy watching the aquatic life, and teens would be happy with the coaster selection. This type of hybrid park was repeated a few times in China. Even in relatively small areas, there was always an opportunity to build a park. Snoopy's World, also in Hong Kong, was a tiny theme park next to a shopping complex. It offered a few kid-sized rides and plenty of spots for photo opportunities featuring Snoopy and the Peanuts gang. Coaster parks, aquariums, and licensed character parks were nothing new in the USA. SeaWorld, Universal Studios, and Knott's Berry Farm had been running successfully for a few generations. Something that was new in China were the religious parks. Noah's Ark on Ma Wan Island, as part of the Ma Wan Park, was funded and built by the construction magnate Kwok Brothers and 5 Christian organizations. Christianity was obviously a minority religion in China, but it had a strong following with evangelicals. The park featured life-size replicas of over 60 different species, a theater, restaurant, hotel, obstacle course, and actors portraying ancient pilgrims and Roman soldiers. Noah's Ark is definitely geared towards families with small children, but those that are thinking about visiting it on a trip overseas, just remember that the island of Ma Wan does not allow cars, so visitors have to park and cross over. It's still a good way to explore the sights in relative peace and quiet. Something that was gaining popularity in the amusement world was green tourism, or ecotourism. Conservation groups preserving nature in rapidly industrializing areas now have local governments and citizens supporting their efforts. These parks try to leave the smallest possible impact on nature and, where they can, try to keep pollution, whether from food or water waste, to a bare minimum. There were now tourism companies that helped organize trips to parks for eco-friendly consumers. Visitors that want to get away from the city may not be able to afford a trip to an island paradise, but they can at least drive a few hours and find themselves surrounded by nature. Even in Hong Kong, there was a place to escape the noise of the big city. The Hong Kong Wetland Park was a prime example of green tourism done right. Visitors could find out about the efforts to rescue and rehabilitate the animals that were found in the bay. They could see firsthand how the diverse plants help feed the aquatic life, as well as see the birds and reptiles that called the park home. This was one of the 5-year projects that China had focused on in time for the new millennium, and they did an admirable job in the process. The diversity of parks in Hong Kong were nothing compared to those that sprang up on the mainland. Shanghai Disneyland went anything but according to plan. The construction kept getting hit with setbacks, and in that time, many parks opened and blossomed. I would argue that Guangxi had a lot to do with why domestic corporations were able to get things done in a fraction of the time of the Disney company, or actually, the Shanghai Shendi Group. Just as the country had become saturated with knockoff products, so too would they find themselves saturated with theme parks within a decade. In the next podcast, The Pink Monorail, will take a look at how some of these parks were stealing thunder from Shanghai Disneyland. A special shout out to our sponsor, Circa 1955. Nicole is the founder of Luxe Illume, a small company that makes candles, wax melts, and room sprays. She's also a huge Disney fan and has a line called Circa 1955. Nicole creates scents inspired by all things Disney. This includes the parks, attractions, treats, and films. Her candles are second to none. Nicole creates each formula and batch of candles herself. For every 1 scent she's released, she's probably made over 200 trials just to get the smell just right. She also donates to local charities, so when you support a small business, you're supporting your community. But of course, don't take my word for it. Go to circa1955.com, order a candle, and use promo code PINK15 to get 15% off your purchase. You're going to love it. Another shout out to Jim Hill for hosting the Pink Monorail podcast on his podcast network. Pink Monorail features Shelley and Alice. My name is Noah, and I'm filling in for this China series. The Jim Hill podcast network also includes Looking at Lucasfilm with Dan Zer, The Disney Dish with Len Testa, I Want That with Shelley, Marvel Us Disney with Aaron Adams, and Fine Tuning with Drew Taylor. Thanks for listening. And be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review for each podcast. Thanks, and I hope to see you again.